Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome, amidst all the chaos that's happening on India-Canada relations, someone who's been watching this for a very long time. Some may say all his life. Terry Glavin is a veteran writer, journalist, researcher, an expert really on India Canadian ties and also on the specific case of Khalistan and Khalistani or the Khalistani movement. I invited Terry Glavin to come and talk to me to give a historical perspective to the chaos that we are seeing. India, of course, has decided to bar visas, Canadians from Indian visas, and people expect that more will happen in that direction. Canada has, till now, when we are talking, uh, has not been able to really provide any evidence of Justin Trudeau's accusation that Indian intelligence agencies were behind the killing in Canada of the terror accused Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Terry Glavin, thanks very much for joining me.
Well, it's lovely to speak with you.
I want to begin by asking you, Terry, give us a little bit of a historical perspective to this. Justin Trudeau is not the first person in his own family to have engaged in this strange and some may say nefarious manner with the Khalistanis, isn't it?
Yeah, this actually goes back in the Liberal Party some decades, and in the case of his own family, his father, um, who was very much an enthusiast or fascinated by China and the Chinese Communist Party, refused to extradite Tavinder Singh Parmar and other people who went on to blow up Air India and to plan and plot the Air India atrocity under the noses of the RCMP and intelligence agencies. He refused to extradite him to India, where he was wanted to. Parmar was wanted on murder charges and so on. And then, of course, the whole Air India disaster. India was quite. I mean, most of those people were Canadian citizens on that flight. Curiously, I'd been on that very airplane myself only a few months earlier, and I also curiously I actually happened to be visiting family in Cork in Ireland just the day before the plane went down off Sheepshead Bay. I mean, it's such an incredible, just a heartbreaking tragedy. And it all happened, it was all planned and plotted in Canada. And so this has a history. There's a real history to this that I have some, while I think suitably patriotic as a Canadian, in what is a very nasty quarrel with India at the moment, I must confess that I have, and it's got me into a bit of trouble here, I have some sympathy for the research and analysis wing in the fact of the matter, and I think it's particularly under the Modi government, the research and analysis wing has made fairly significant efforts to have a presence in Canada, particularly in the Gurudwaras. And I got to say, I can't blame them, because there's absolutely no trust, and there's no cause for trust between the government of India and its law enforcement and intelligence agencies with the national security and intelligence establishment in Canada. I mean, just look at our history.
Talk to us a little bit about, you just mentioned this is a long history in the Liberal Party too. Um, to many Indians, what is shocking is that, Canada, which is always seen as this extremely peace-loving, polite place. Of course, people know there's a history with Khalistanis, but for something like this to blow up in this manner is astonishing to most Indians. But this kind of support to the Khalistanis have been going on for a long time, isn't it? At the time when you were researching all of this, as you were telling me just before this conversation began, in many ways, the government or governments in Canada were welcoming the Khalistanis as if Khalistan was a separate country.
Yeah, it was a very strange, very peculiar state of affairs. And I think it's because we're trying to be nice, you see. I remember, you see, when the Khalistanis established Vancouver as the capital of their government in exile. This goes way back to the 1980s now. They had an office, Republic of Khalistan. And the office would get official and formal invitations from the province of British Columbia to state banquets and so on. Um, and so, it was around that time that the research and analysis wing began to increase its presence in the High Commission in Ottawa and in consulates across the country. And also, the Indian government tried to explain to Canadians that this was a very dangerous and indeed violent terrorist movement. And we should be very careful, and that no good would come of this. And I was, when I was a kid reporter, I interviewed Talvinder Singh Parmar 5 years before he plotted and planned the Air India atrocity. And I'd been writing these stories, and the Sikh community particularly was extremely disturbed by the degree to which the Khalistani element was insinuating itself into the leadership of the Gurudwaras across the country, and they were quite violent in doing that. So I went to India, and I was filing freelance for the Globe and Mail in the lead up to Operation Blue Star, and I interviewed Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala and Harchand Singh Longowal and all of the people inside were sort of armed inside the Golden Temple complex. And it has been a bit, I have to say, it has been a bit of a personal heartbreak to me, watching this happen and not being really, writing it all, and it's all, here's the evidence, it's all there. And my government not really doing anything about it.
Was a little bit about the how the Khalistani movement has spread. There was a little bit of time in the mid 2000s or so when one thought that all of this has died out. Certainly, it has been dead in Punjab. But suddenly, in the last few years, this has been re-triggered once again, and there are various assessments that have been given on why this is true. My own personal assessment is that as India has put more and more pressure in ensuring the sovereignty of Kashmir, uh, you know, drug money via Punjab has flown into the gangs, the Khalistani gangs in Canada.
Yes.
As the US left Afghanistan, more and more drug trade, bloomed once again, and this entire chain, so to speak, has got re-triggered. I wonder what's your theory.
Well, I think this is very, very close to my reading of the situation. There's a couple of things that have happened in, say, the last decade. The first is, I regret to say, and I don't mean to be partisan or uncharitable, but it's the election of the Trudeau Liberals. That party is almost like the Justin Trudeau party. And he brought with him quite a number of Sikh MPs and cabinet ministers. And I don't want to disparage them. There's a couple of leading liberal Sikh MPs and cabinet ministers that I have tremendous respect for. But you see, what happens is that it's really difficult to distinguish or draw hard and fast lines between the Sikh leadership, the Gurdwara leadership in Canada, the Khalistanis, organizations like the World Sikh Organizations, the militant Khalistani groups like the Sikhs for Justice, and so on, and these criminal gangs that you mentioned. In the last 18 months, I believe there's been, if I'm not, well, I'll say a couple of dozen anyway, targeted killings in the underworld in and around Surrey, British Columbia, which is the center, along with Brampton and a couple of other places in Canada, of the Sikh communities in the country. It's all about cocaine, and it's all about meth, and it's all about gun running. And these guys take on a kind of a Khalistani brand. And similarly, the Khalistanis and the Dashmesh Regiment people Khalistan Tiger Force and so on, they take on a kind of a gang aura about them. And so, I mean, one of the ways I've put it, what has Justin Trudeau done here on Monday? I would say it comes as much as a surprise to Canadians as it does to people of India, is that he's basically taken a side in a Surrey gang war, and he's picked sides. And he was humiliated at the G20. Nobody seemed to want to talk to him. Modi was very frosty with him. And I think, I mean, I'm no apologist for Narendra Modi by a long shot, but you can kind of get it. You can kind of understand why Modi might be a little bit annoyed by Justin, who always seems to want to be the sort of belle of the ball. He wants to be the center of attention. And he was, treated like a matinee idol by the international press when he was first elected. And, he wants to be a big guy on the world stage. And, he can be annoying in that way. And so I think he returned to Canada in a funk. And then he drops this bomb in the House of Commons. And I think I just want to go back to this business about the gangland hit on Hardeep Singh Nijjar, which started this, and which Trudeau is insinuating very, very strongly that Narendra Modi actually ordered. This bleeding of the Khalistani movement into the gang movement, the gang subculture, I think is really the thing to notice here. The term Indian agents or agents of the Indian government is used very, very, very liberally and promiscuously. And I think the thing to keep your eye on is almost not the hit on Hardeep Singh Nijjar, but the targeted killing of I'm sorry, I got to get rid of this. The targeted killing of another man a year earlier, and that man was Riptaman Singh Malik. Now, one of the things that the Modi government has been doing to some success in Canada is sort of bringing these old Khalistanis in from the cold. It was a reconciliation project. The idea is, there would be the BJP would have, subtle meetings with all these old hardened Khalistanis, and those old hardened Khalistanis would be open to it because the game is up. The people of Punjab are totally uninterested in Khalistan, and a lot of these guys have got import export businesses, or they've got family in India that they want to visit. They want visas. And so Riptaman Singh Malik was actually a co-conspirator and a senior lieutenant of Talvinder Singh Parmar in the Air India plot, and he got away with it. But he was a multi-millionaire, and he decided to come in from the cold. He and his camp were violently and diametrically opposed to Hardeep Singh Nijjar from the Khalistani group and his camp. And it's widely, and in fact, the story is he was going to run a slate against Nijjar in the temple elections at Guru Nanak Temple. And so he gets whacked, he gets killed. And everybody in his camp, in Riptaman Singh Malik's camp, says, well, we know who did this. It was Nijjar. It was Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And so Nijjar gets whacked. So, where do you draw the line is what I'm saying, right? It's a very, very fuzzy line. In the case of Riptaman Singh Malik, between, well, is he an agent of the government of India? He had written a letter to everybody in the Sikh community saying what a wonderful man Narendra Modi was and how good he was being to the Sikhs, and that sort of thing. And And how do you situate Niger? Was he a gangster or was he a Khalistani? So I think this is you really have to navigate through these things to get at the heart of what's going on here. And a lot of people simply don't have that background. You'll read in the mainstream press in Canada that Sikhs for Justice is a human rights organization. You know, um, so that's kind of that's getting into the weeds.
We also come to something else that people want to know. It's not just the Khalistanis, Terry, is it? Because the Sri Lankans would say that, Canadians harbored certain very dubious elements and were part of their civil war at one point. The Bangladeshis still have something against, you know, Canadian governments for harboring some, again, extremely dubious personalities. Why is it that so many people who ought to be ought to be prosecuted in different parts of the world land up on Canadian shores and manage to circumvent the system to get some safe refuge?
Well, I think in Canada there's a couple of main reasons for that. Canada has always, I think, quite rightly and properly prided itself in being a place where the victims of persecution and the people who are put upon by torture states will be welcome in Canada. And I think that's great. I think that's something actually we should be proud of. And so there is this kind of mosaic, that our idea of ourselves, very different than a European or an American idea, as being a kind of mosaic, and the early ideas of multiculturalism, which have been completely eclipsed by this later notion of multiculturalism that Trudeau has brought in. Trudeau, has after he was elected, he gave an interview to the New York Times and he said, Canada's a post-national state. There's no mainstream, and to say that we've had open borders would be putting it mildly. And this is particularly true in the case of the Mandarin bloc, from mainland China, well-connected, very wealthy people, loyal to the Communist Party of China, have completely eclipsed the old Chinese, Cantonese-speaking Taishanese in Canada. And similarly, something did start to happen. There's an incredible blossoming of Sikh migration to Canada in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Sikhs here, they go back a long way, like in my old neighborhood, out my back window, right across the little lane was the Sikh Temple Sukhsagar, which was built in 1911. So, but the community really began to change in the 1970s and the 1980s. And another thing is we do not have anti-terror law in this country that is very well developed. We don't have, and I'm not so sure that I would complain about this myself, being kind of a free speech guy and a journalist and everything, but we don't have laws against the glorification of terrorism in this country. Britain does. I think 30 European countries do. The Americans are a little bit dodgy about that kind of thing. And so, it is not uncommon. You can drive down the main drag in Surrey and, just take a right and you'll see big posters of Talvinder Singh Parmar. And I mean, Parmar carried off the worst act of terrorism in civil aviation history prior to 9/11, the worst act of terrorism in Canadian history. And yet, there he is. There's his poster. And now his posters lately have been, you see Hardeep Singh Nijjar's face beside Talvinder Singh Parmar's face on these posters and billboards and so on.
I may ask you, Terry. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's the best way to answer that particular question about what makes Canada so distinct in these ways.
Therefore, if I may ask you, do you think that all the things that you're describing, I mean, only a madman would say that they are bad, right? Values of openness, uncompromising support for free speech, and so on and so forth. However, do you think something that has been said about, say, certain kinds of virulent Islamists, for instance, in the UK and some other places, and so on and so forth? Canada's open system has been abused by some people, including the Khalistanis. Would that be correct?
Oh, definitely correct. You raised the issue of Islamists. That's also very true. In Canada, we have this one of the things, when I talked about the sort of new multiculturalism that replaced the kind of multiculturalism that was flourishing and lovely and wonderful, certainly in my childhood. I mean, I didn't know many. Well, that's not true. I mean, I had a lot of, certainly Irish Catholic friends because that's my background and we're an immigrant family. But most of my pals were, Sikhs, and they were Cantonese people, and they were, the sons and daughters of Japanese fishermen along the river. And what we've done lately is, for example, we've created this thing called the Muslim community in Canada. Well, I can think of at least 8 or 9 main Muslim traditions in Canada that all, each have their own splendid and flourishing little customs and traditions and practices and what have you. Um, and among the, sort of mainline Muslim organizations that are often funded by the federal government, you'll find the most virulent anti-Semitism, just horrible stuff. And everybody kind of looks the other way. And says, well, Israel, Palestine, or some excuse like that. And that's what happens, I think, when you embrace this notion that there is no mainstream and that we're a post-national country. Um, and for me, I mean, the people, because my beat, if you like, as a journalist, is international human rights and foreign policy, and I'm also a senior fellow with the Raoul Wallenberg Center of Human Rights. My friends and interlocutors and contacts and sources will tend to be Syrian refugees, Syrian democratic revolutionaries, Hong Kongers, Uyghurs, and so on. And they're not being served by this new idea at all. Because if you see all Muslims, as some kind of a undifferentiated bloc, and if you see all Sikhs as this, the kinds of people that you will see favored by federal policy, the temple leadership, the Gurdwaras, and so on, then the people who you're not listening to are, in the case, and this is particularly pronounced in recent years, in the case of the Chinese diaspora, the Uyghurs, the Falun Gong people, Taiwanese, Tibetans, is that the government just doesn't care about them, doesn't listen to them. And in the case of China, the Chinese government and its proxies in Canada get away with murder, terrorizing and harassing and intimidating and threatening all of the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are in the lower rungs with the Mandarin bloc at the top. And a similar sort of thing has happened in the case of the Sikh community. It's difficult to do in a broad way among Indo-Canadians because there's Indo-Canadians include all kinds of people and secular people and Christians from Goa and particularly Hindus. But, it's all about power, and bless their hearts, the Sikhs have been very, very effective in Canada, not just in integrating, but in, taking significant leadership positions politically. They're not so much interested in municipal politics, but the Sikhs are quite significantly overrepresented if we're looking at it as a kind of an ethnic bloc at the federal level. And the other thing I think we have to remember is that there's a price that you will pay if you're a Sikh, and if you have any aspirations, any ambitions to rise in the community, in the Sikh community or in the broader Canadian society, you have to be very, very careful. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous. And I learned this myself personally when my friend Tara Singh, the editor of the Indo-Canadian Times, was shot and killed. And this was after he'd already been shot and put in a wheelchair. And Ujjwal Singh Dosanjh, who was I knew him well before he got into politics, who went on to become the Premier of British Columbia and a Liberal cabinet minister. He was beaten within an inch of his life by the Khalistanis for simply taking a moderate position on questions related to Khalistan and Air India and so on. And curiously, the man who beat him within an inch of his life with an iron bar was a fellow by the name of Jaspal Singh Atwal, who went on to be convicted in the attempted assassination of a Punjab cabinet minister, and ended up in Trudeau's entourage during Trudeau's visit to India in 2018. So
this was exactly what was pointed out and created a huge controversy in India.
Yeah. So, I have some sympathy for the, even though I'm a Canadian and I'm very, very possessive of Canadian sovereignty and so on. I gotta say, I gotta have some sympathy for Indians who are concerned about their own national unity and their own sovereignty. And they're thinking, what the hell? What's going on in Canada? And how come these guys are parading around? And, the latest is, for instance, the Sikhs for Justice, after Hardeep Singh was whacked. They were putting out posters, with murderer written on them, and the face of Canada's or the India's High Commissioner to Canada. And just this past week,
which is essentially, and I'm sure you understand this as well as I do, doing something like that is essentially asking for that person to be
no, it's an incitement to murder.
Yeah, it's an incitement to murder.
And this past week, their billboards or their leaflets have the High Commissioner's photograph and his two of his consuls general with a $10,000 reward for their home addresses. So this is clearly and obviously incitement to murder, incitement to terror. And nobody even they're just getting a little bit full of high spirits. So yeah, I do have a little bit of sympathy with the Indian government's revulsion with what's going on here. And lastly, by the way, on the simple question, like, we have to remember, what did Trudeau say, right? If you look very carefully at what he said, and the stuff that came after, clearly insinuating that Narendra Modi ordered a hit on Niger. What he said was, over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Okay. Well, for one thing, there's absolutely nothing new in the fact that Canadian security agencies and the Integrated Homicide Investigation Team and the RCMP have been hearing about Indian agents did it, and they've been following every lead because they're responsible law enforcement agencies. They've been pursuing these allegations, so that's not even new, right? And the allegation that, as Trudeau describes, what he's talking about is of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the hit on Hardeep Singh Nijjar. But he inserted the word credible in there. Credible allegations of a potential link. So essentially what he's done is, what is essentially effectively a conspiracy theory that
He's validated it without providing any
yeah, he's
evidence.
endorsed it. He's
Yeah.
endorsed it. And the other thing is that the community, and I have to say this, is riven with conspiracy theories. Just a little while ago, there was some really unpardonable acts of vandalism against a Hindu temple in Ontario, and the obvious culprits would have been some of these young hothead Khalistani types who associate the Hindu community in Canada with Modi. But the Ontario Gurdwaras Committee issues a press release alleging that it was Indian government agents who did this, knowing that it would be pinned on Sikhs. So everybody's an Indian government agent, right? And in the case
Yeah.
of Ripuman Singh Malik, as I say, could you call his people Indian agents? Well, in the lexicon of the Gurdwaras, all of those guys who came in from the cold, and all of those Sikhs who are open supporters of Modi are understood as and described as agents of the government of India.
Well,
And so in that broader community, yeah, they probably whacked an Nijjar. So that's one thing. And the other thing is a very, I think, interesting and useful question to ask is it possible that Modi has simply had it? He's just had it with this. He's done. And that he's decided to pursue a policy, given Canada's, the Trudeau government's active interruption and obstruction of the BJP's attempts to, reach out to reformed Khalistanis and bring them in from the cold. Is it possible that Narendra Modi is Golda Meir post-Munich? Do you know what I mean? After the Munich
yes,
massacre, Golda
of
Meir said,
course.
okay, we're going to find out who these people
Yes.
are. We don't care where they are. We're going to whack them.
Yes.
Maybe Modi has basically had it. Maybe he said, look, we've never been able to trust the Canadian national security and intelligence
And now they're
establishment.
putting a price on the head of our diplomats who live there.
Exactly. So maybe, who knows? But if it's true, I mean, I think it's silly to imagine that Modi said, oh, this guy Nijjar, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, yes, we'll send assassins over to Canada and shoot him.
I want
It's
to
not
ask you a
as
question about that, and also about what Trudeau said in the UN. But I want to ask you, Terry, soon after Justin Trudeau said that in the House of Commons, before any evidence was provided at all, the first person who rushed to blame it on the Indian Prime Minister was, of course, Jagmeet Singh. Now,
of
knowing
course,
the history of the Khalistani movement and knowing that India has already lost one prime minister who was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards after the storming of the Golden Temple, this too is putting a pin, isn't it? I mean, you're basically essentially pointing towards a direction without any evidence.
oh, of course.
And God forbid, tomorrow if something happens, who's to blame?
Of course. You have to remember about Jagmeet Singh is that it wasn't until he was publicly challenged on this matter, and I'm thinking 2018. So that's nearly 40 years, I guess, after the Air India atrocity. It wasn't until he was he was elected leader of the NDP, and after a big scandal about his accommodation of these conspiracy theories that he finally said, yeah, okay, it wasn't the government of India that brought down the Air India plane. It wasn't Indian agents. It was Talvinder Singh Parmar. Okay, I agree. I mean, this is just how high up it goes and how deep it goes. And the other thing is that one of the things that you have to remember about Jagmeet Singh is that he really does have Trudeau kind of over a barrel. Because of Trudeau's Liberals are in a minority government situation. It's effectively a coalition government. And it was, I'm going to say, was it 2020? Every year the public safety ministry produces a report on threats to Canada's national security. And in that year, the Khalistan movement was identified as a threat to, security issues in Canada. And Jagmeet Singh complained about this. And that report was, I'm not making this up, was actually withdrawn. The printed versions were shredded, and it was reissued with all reference to Khalistan removed. So I'm thinking, if you're working in the intelligence section of the Indian High Commission in Ottawa, and you're getting all these reports across your desk, and you're paying close attention to the things you're supposed to be noticing, and you get, the annual report from the public safety minister, his little signature at the bottom, and it makes these oblique references to movements trying to carve an independent state out of India, but it doesn't say who they are. I mean, there are, you would know better than I, but the last I counted, I think there's something like 33 different, to varying degrees, separatist, sovereignist, independentist organizations, groups, ethnicities in India. I mean, so like, which one are we talking about here? Are we talking about some Assamese group who want independence in Assam? So it's this kind of thing. You're not allowed to sort of name the issue that we're dealing with here. Nobody wants to use the term Khalistan, Khalistani. You're not allowed to talk about it.
I also want to ask you, we were saying slightly earlier in the conversation that some of this had to a degree died down and it has been brought back again. Today, we heard Justin Trudeau at the United Nations make these claims once again, without any evidence. How far do you think he can really dig in his heels on this if evidence doesn't surface?
Well, the difficulty he's got now is, how do you walk something like this back? You can't walk it back. I mean, he's gone past the point of no return on this. And he doesn't even, you look carefully, this is interesting. When you look carefully, actually, at his statement, and I read it earlier, he doesn't even claim to have evidence. He says he claims to be aware of what he has described as credible allegations of a potential link, right? And I think an interesting thing happened that later that day, our own foreign minister, Melanie Joly, she kind of gave the game away, because she said the words that she used were, if proven true, this would be really bad. In other words, she doesn't even believe that this is true. She doesn't even know, that there's any evidence to support this contention. If proven
That's exactly
true,
what I thought when I heard her. She doesn't know. She has no idea.
I should also say that, and I don't want to be telling tales out of school here. Like, there's a very small community of journalists in Canada who cover the issues that I cover, foreign interference, the spy versus spy stuff, the Khalistan issue, and so on. And two reporters that have been really out ahead on breaking stories in recent months are Bob Fife and Steve Chase at the Globe and Mail. And the way, what the story in the press gallery, and I've talked to Steve about this, is essentially that what Trudeau was preempted. He heard that Steve and Bob were coming out with a story. And so he said, well, whatever, I better do it now. I better say it now. And it was the first day that the House had resumed after the summer recess. And so he comes out with a story. And let me tell you, he went a hell of a lot further than Fife and Chase were willing to go at the Globe and Mail. In fact, Bob Fife has been quite clear. He doesn't know what this evidence is. He doesn't know. They have really good sources in CSIS, and he knows that there are people in CSIS who consider these allegations to be credible, or at least they are aware of these allegations. And the way CSIS defines its intelligence is that, a preponderance of allegations amounts to evidence. Isn't the kind of evidence that a cop will use or could be used in a court of law. But as I say, what do we mean by Indian agents? Do we mean, as Trudeau has insinuated, that Modi ordered a hit? Or do we mean the term as it's used in the language of common speech among Khalistanis and the temple leadership in the Gurudwaras across the country? So what's an Indian agent? I don't know. And even if it were true, what I think it exposes is that the government of India cannot trust the government of Canada to keep this thing under control, to keep it in check. And not only that, but seems to be happy to counsel and give it courage and comfort, and make sure that its national security documentation doesn't even mention the word. and there we have it. It's it's a real rat's nest. It's a real rat's nest, and like I say, it involves I think not unreasonable intrusions by intelligence agencies into the Sikh community in Canada. And I know that's controversial to say, but I'll say it. It's perfectly understandable. So it involves all that, and that's always very murky. And it involves former Khalistani extremists and terrorists who were never convicted, even though everybody knows what they did. But all the wiretaps were lost and erased by mistake. Oops. That community, that generation, many of whom are now saying, well, we're giving it up because nobody in India is interested in all this kind of stuff, and Modi wants to make friends with us, so yeah, we'll be friendly to Modi. So are they Indian agents? And then you look at the Khalistanis, and I should say that I suppose there are Sikhs who are genuinely possessed of what I consider to be a delusional idea that some sort of peaceful creation of something like a Sikh state might be negotiated in Punjab. Okay, well, that's certainly not what the Sikhs for Justice is interested in. I don't know if you've seen their map of Khalistan, but they're
Anyway, that map,
openly.
Terry, since you mentioned the map, my apologies, I must come in here. What intrigues many Indians about that map by the so-called human rights group called Sikhs for Justice, which is essentially, as we were discussing, has very dubious links. That map doesn't have, if you really want Khalistan, that map doesn't have Lahore, the old
It
great
doesn't have
capital
anything in
of
Pakistan.
Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
Doesn't have anything in Pakistan, but it's got, gosh, bits of, was it Himachal Pradesh? Is that possible? Uttar Pradesh? Bits of all kinds, of other
But it has
states.
Delhi, of all places, parts of Madhya Pradesh
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
and
So,
Uttar
I
Pradesh.
mean, how this is spectacularly unserious, is what I'm saying. But I want to try to be decent, and I want to try to say maybe it's true that there are Sikhs who entertain these fantasies, and they have no expectation or wish for a violent or subversive attainment of this this fairy tale. So there's that. But there's also the gang culture, and this is gang warfare. This is gang warfare, and it's serious business. And just last week there was another hit. There was another 2 hits last month, and they're almost all the same. They always, it's a couple of guys, bang bang, the man is dead. There's a driver of a getaway car, and it's a stolen car, and then the car is found on fire. This is, happens in every single case. Interestingly, in the case of Niger, the car wasn't burned. That's the only thing that makes it any different from any of these other gangland hits that we've seen in recent months and years in and around the Guru Nanak Temple.
I want to also come to something that you mentioned earlier, the reasons why Trudeau rushed into this. For weeks on end, and we of course read about this in our papers here in India too. For weeks on end, the Canadian media actually has been exposing Chinese interference into Canadian polls and into the heart of the Liberal Party, isn't it? Tell us
That's
something about
true.
that.
Well, yeah, I've been on this. This is actually a story that I've been covering as closely as I've been covering the Khalistani story for several years. And it really is about, the guy that Trudeau picked to head his transition after he was elected in 2015 and appoint all his cabinet ministers was the former president of the Canada-China Business Council. And Senator Yen Pao Wu and and that guy's name is Peter Harder, and Trudeau saw to it that he was given the most senior position in the Senate. And all around him are people from the Canada-China Business Council, the Power Corporation, SNC Lavalin, other major international corporations with deep interests in India. His entire economic and foreign policy strategy was basically written by an outfit called McKinsey and Associates, headed up by Dominic Barton, who spent half his career in China and served on the boards of several Chinese state-owned enterprises. People will often ask me, man, the Chinese must have something on Trudeau. They must have some, what the Russians used to call compromat. They must have they got something on the guy. Otherwise, why would he be behaving this way? And the truth of it is he just doesn't see anything wrong with it. He thinks it's fine. He thinks it's perfectly fine. And so in recent months, it's really started to get nasty because there is overwhelming evidence now that this vast network of extremely well-connected and wealthy Beijing-connected United Front operatives, if you like, this infrastructure in Canada, was mobilized to the Liberal Party's benefit in the 2019 and 2021 federal elections. In some cases, when we're talking about the United Front Work Department, which is, the main sort of influence peddling and strong-arming operation run out of Beijing. Its budget is, I think, 2 or 3 times the size of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. When you look at that constituency in several key Canadian ridings, it's indistinguishable from the fundraising base and the candidate selection base for the Liberal Party of Canada. So that is really coming back to burn Trudeau because of these recent revelations. There were, I think, 3 resolutions in the House of Commons that passed calling for a public inquiry into the matter that the Trudeau government has resisted and has blockaded and ambuscaded. And finally, they were forced to say, okay, we'll have a public inquiry. And the first day of that, officially, of that public inquiry was Monday. And so, the rubber was about to hit the road on the whole foreign influence issue. And I don't think, quite frankly, I don't think Trudeau's loyalties and his notions have really changed all that much. And so here you have, the Americans and to some extent the Europeans, certainly Japan, have been developing a kind of there's an emerging consensus on how to deal with China, how to contain China. And India is a problem. India's it's got its issues. It's got its issues with China, certainly, but it's also reliant, I think, very, very badly exposed to Russia. So there was an initiative that largely led by Biden, like, let's deal with Modi on his terms, right? Like, how can we figure this out? We're all democracies here. And then Trudeau comes in and blows it all up. I mean, the other thing is, we're hearing expressions of support, or what sound like expressions of support, from Canada's Five Eyes partners, which is to say the United States, Britain, New Zealand, and Australia, and so, G7 circles and so on, about expressions of concern about these allegations of Modi assassinating a guy in Canada. There have been no expulsions of diplomats, except for the tit for tat Canada, India. Let's go through the motions. We'll kick out a guy and you kick out a guy. Think about the last time, one of the most obvious analogy would be the poisoning of that Russian dissident in London, the Skripal poisoning by Russia. There were, I think, more than 100 diplomats, Russian diplomats, were expelled all over the world after that was revealed. Well, I don't think that many people are taking what Justin Trudeau has to say all that seriously. I mean, people will say, well, it's realpolitik. We need to be friendly to Modi. Yeah, there's that. But that doesn't mean that, I mean, if there was actual evidence that Trudeau had presented to any of these of our allies that he's been talking about, particularly the Americans, you can bet that Joe Biden would, he'd be shouting his head off at Modi, and, they'd have a good argument, and Modi would explain what the heck was going on. And Jen Psaki or whoever would have a press conference in Washington, D.C., and utter all these stern, words, and maybe a diplomat would be expelled. Maybe there would be high-level discussions about how to resolve this, and some commitment from India would be secured, guaranteeing that they wouldn't do this sort of thing again. But there's been none of that. All you've got is Justin Trudeau saying, trust me. This is the interesting thing, too, about this story. There's one source, and it's Justin Trudeau. It's like he's the star of his own movie. He's playing himself in the movie. And that's it. I mean, and even, as I say, even his own foreign minister hasn't the faintest idea whether it's true or not. So,
no, please continue.
It's bad.
In conclusion, Terry, if I may ask you, there could be, and we've gone through, a lot of very interesting history. We've looked at it from various perspectives. There is an opinion, though, and I think that opinion is gathering strength among commentators, that some of it could just be the fact that Justin Trudeau is not in touch with reality, to put it very politely. And even many Canadians seem to say that. Would you think there's any merit to that?
Well, yeah,
argument?
I think that's always been the case. That's always been a forefront in the various sort of analyses of what Justin Trudeau is always about. He lives his own rich fantasy life. He's the star of his own movie. That first year or two, he was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. He'd go to the World Economic Forum in Davos and he'd show everybody his lovely socks. He shows up at all the pride parades. He's this groovy guy. He's definitely, he doesn't live in the world that most people live in. He's had a very, very, very privileged life. He comes right out. Basically, he's a celebrity culture guy. He's almost like Donald Trump in that way, right? And his support, by the way, is very much like Donald Trump's support. It's kind of a cult. they're Trudeau all the way. It's Trudeau, all the way, and it doesn't matter what he
You're the
does.
second Canadian analyst who mentioned the unmistakable similarity between Trump and Trudeau today to me. It's
Yeah,
very
I've written
interesting.
about this. I've written about this actually quite a bit. It is quite fascinating to me. Um, and that, what's his name? Jake Tapper at CNN noticed this too in the United States. That strange QAnon movement that's associated with the Trumpists in the United States. Jake Tapper says in Canada you've got Truanon. I mean, it really is a dear
Yeah.
leader cult. And the other thing is, you got to remember Canada's unique first past the post parliamentary system. When Trudeau was elected, voter turnout was low, wasn't great, and only a fifth of Canadians voted for him, for his party. And in the public opinion polls now, you know this reedy little fellow, Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, is miles ahead of Trudeau. And the bloom has really gone off the rose, I think. And this might be something that is affecting his behavior and maybe even his mental health a little bit. Is that, he's not he's like this fading, past his prime matinee idol. He's not getting the big parts anymore. And when he shows up in places like Delhi for the G20, and he walks in the room and he expects everybody to be posing for selfies with him. It's like, oh yeah, that's that Trudeau guy again. God. So it can't be easy on the guy. But yeah, the thing of it is, I think this is something that everybody is saying now. The leader of the opposition, the Conservatives, I think, have taken a very sober and responsible position, similar to the position of the New Democratic Party leader in British Columbia. The editorial boards of the newspapers are all now saying look, you got to stop this. You've got to be open and transparent with Canadians about this. You have to tell us what you know. If you know anything, if there is any evidence, you need to put it on the table, and you need to do it now. And he clearly hasn't done that with with all these other G7 and Five Eyes leaders that
Because
he's been with.
today at the UN, it almost sounded like he was asking India to provide the evidence. India must
Yeah,
cooperate
I
with
noticed
us
that.
with our investigation to ensure that we get evidence. But that sounds strange.
That was one of the first things he said. And the thing is, we signed a very solemn sounding intelligence sharing agreement with India in
Right.
2018.
That's right.
And, that hasn't done us any good. That hasn't done India any good.
Was
So,
the
and
trip where he
let's be fair. A
that's
lot of
where
the stuff,
that was the trip when Trudeau and family spent many days
oh,
around India wearing
oh,
wedding clothes each time.
oh, please. I remember, oh, God. It was, yeah, his magical mystery tour of India, all the costume pageantry.
The Bollywood costume.
My God. Yeah, I know. I mean, I hate to be like this. I know I sound mean and partisan and everything, but how embarrassing was that? And then a convicted terrorist, shows up in his entourage. Lord
And which was
Almighty.
actually pointed out by one of the, it wasn't even pointed out by somebody in the BJP. It was first, ruckus was first made about this by a Congress politician from the Punjab.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. It's so sad. I gotta say, like I like Harjit Singh. He used to be our defense minister. I don't know what they got him doing now. My mom really liked him, by the way. He's this military guy. And, the poor guy goes up to Punjab in 2018, and Amrinder Singh, the chief minister, won't even meet with him. He says, you got to get your act together. You tell me, you should put your cards on the table about where you stand on Khalistan, and I'll meet with you, but not before. I mean, it's so embarrassing. And I think the whole thing is, I think, very, it's dividing the community here in Canada. It's extremely divisive within the Sikh community and within the broader Indo-Canadian community. Very divisive.
What is terrible is that, I think till now, Khalistanis or no Khalistanis, most Indians thought of Canada as a, as a naturally pleasant, happy place to be. There would always be jokes about, nothing really bad ever happens in Canada, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah,
And
well, here's the joke. How do you say hello in Canadian? I'm
how?
sorry. Yeah, you're right. You're right. That's the viewpoint. And I'm really kind of heartbroken by this. I spent a lot of time in India, up in the Northeast, and whenever I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, that's been one of my stories. And I always go through Delhi and try to unwind in Delhi. And I love Punjab. It's been a while since I've been in Punjab, but we like each other.
Yeah,
Indians
yeah,
and Canadians, we've always been pals.
correct, correct.
And this is not good. This is not healthy. And I really do hope that whatever the politics, and like I say, I'm no apologist for Narendra Modi, but whatever the politics here, I really do hope that the people of India, the intelligentsia, the media, people like yourselves, will always remember that we actually, Canadians are kind of idiot. We're kind of goofy, but we're not bad people. And Justin Trudeau, is not the face of Canada.
I agree.
He's
And,
not.
it's quite interesting. And, in conclusion, I mean, what astounds many, sort of people who are a little more engaged with politics and international affairs is how would a democracy, a wealthy democracy like Canada, who's looking to get a foothold in the Indo-Pacific with its own strategy, look to blow all of this up with with a country of 1.4 billion people at the heart
Exactly.
of the Indo-Pacific and the fifth largest economy in the world? It makes no sense.
Well, what you will hear when that question is raised, and it's really ridiculous too, is people will say, "Well, maybe it makes no sense, but that doesn't mean we should allow Narendra Modi to kill Canadian citizens, especially outside of a place of worship."
For
It's like,
that we
oh,
need evidence.
well, exactly. In other words, if we believe Trudeau's little story here, the only way any of this makes sense is if you have to believe Trudeau. It's not about what we are allowed to know. It's about what we are expected to believe. And you raised a very good point there a second ago. I meant to raise it earlier, is that not only are we threatening to blow up this consensus that largely is American led, of sort of bringing India into an understanding, a global understanding about how we all have to take China very seriously. It's increasingly belligerent. It's increasingly militarized. How do we all sort of say, look, we're all democracies here. How do we put aside our differences and figure out our trade complexities? Not only is Trudeau threatening to blow that up, but he's blown up Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. He's blown up he's like he's walked into this room with a suicide vest. Canada's own Indo-Pacific strategy, which was supposed to be our escape from this absolutely catastrophic China policy that Trudeau, he refused to let go of it even after China kidnapped Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, are two Canadian citizens, and kept them in
Right.
prison for, gosh, what was that now? 2.5 years, three
Yeah.
years, I forget. And by the way, what did Canada do during that period? We got ourselves up a petition and we asked other countries to sign the petition. The petition said kidnapping is bad, and it didn't even name China. So the Indo-Pacific strategy was supposed to be, this is how we get out from under Justin's ridiculous, his the fact that he's been this sort of unrequited suitor around Beijing. How do we get out of that? And so we got this thing called the Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, now we've blown it up. It's our own strategy. So not only, is everybody pulling away from China, and China is totally toxic now. But the largest Mother India, for the love of God, Mother India. Now we can't deal with them now. Like, what the hell? What the hell?
Here's both you and I really hope, Terry, for better times and a deep understanding of love and affection and friendship between Indians and Canadians, which have always existed. And hopefully, the day will come soon enough when both of us, look beyond this incident and laugh about it. Terry Glavin, thanks very much for sparing
Oh,
all
it's
this
been a
time to talk
delight.
to me.
It's been a delight.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time for taking me through this history and providing all this context. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, you take care of yourself now.